All right, so this week's lecture is on finances and emerging adulthood. One big kind of important thing to note that we see in a lot of emerging adults is this kind of shame and concern over taking out debt, even though early adulthood is actually the best time to do this. So kind of the best practice is to borrow more money early on when you're not making very much. Midlife, you start saving, and then after retirement, you start spending. A lot of people don't do this. People tend to underconsume in their 20s and 30s when they have the potential to borrow against their future earnings for things like homes and education and businesses. So youth is kind of the time to take advantage of financial risks that will pay off later on. One of the important things to look at is kind of whether these attitudes have changed since the recession around 2008. So we know if we look at people in the generation that went through the Great Depression, their generation is notorious for very conservative spending habits and their kind of emphasis on savings. Emerging adults in the recession have some kind of interesting phenomenon. So one is that they're actually hired more quickly than previous generations. But the reason for this is not that there are more jobs, but just that they're more likely to take a job that they're overqualified for. So they're more likely to take retail and part-time jobs as opposed to previous generations that have kind of held out for better jobs. Especially if we look at what's called Generation X that came of age in the 90s during a tech bubble. There were lots of jobs with really high salaries, and today's graduates really just don't have those expectations. Instead, today's emerging adults are much more likely to consider underpaid or barely paid internships as kind of part of the dues they have to take in order to get the job that they want. We'll talk about fewer car and house loans, but the numbers have fallen pretty dramatically since the recession. And what we find is that if emerging adults do spend money on luxury items, it's often technology. They're not spending a lot of money on things like fancy cars or even fancy restaurants and things like that. And one of the reasons for this might be not that they don't have the potential to get approved for loans and things like that, but that they believe that they won't. Actually, what we see is there's more flexible criteria for credit for things like cars and also home loans. Okay, so in terms of the home ownership, we're seeing fewer emerging adults owning houses after the recession. In 2007, about 40% of emerging adults owned houses, whereas in 2011, 34% did. And we're seeing these interesting kind of demographic trends where there's more desirability to have a house close to town. Emerging adults seem to generally be wanting to live in more denser suburbs with kind of a town center and a store that they can walk to, as opposed to what previous generations have looked at, which is kind of larger houses that are in more suburban neighborhoods, the McMansion type thing. So we're seeing kind of this dramatic increase in urban centers, and emerging adults has sometimes been called Generation Rent, where we see cities growing much faster. Emerging adults are looking for short-term, no-strings-attached apartment living because there are more jobs in these larger cities. And so they really value residence that's kind of near transportation. Now, the big caveat to that is that although emerging adults are afraid of it, mortgage debt is generally good debt because it will pay off in the long run, unlike things like credit card debt where you never get that money back. Okay, another phenomenon that we see fewer emerging adults owning cars after the recession. So in households younger than 25, in 2007, 73% had cars, whereas in 2011, 66% did. And we find that really this generation is not driving like their predecessors did. They don't buy new cars, they drive fewer miles, and there are even fewer teenagers that are actually getting their driver's license. Another kind of example of this is in 1985, 38% of emerging adults bought new vehicles, whereas in 2010, only 27% bought new vehicles. One kind of reason for this, or perhaps a result of this, is we're seeing a lot of more things like car sharing or bike sharing. Zipcar is an example of this, where basically it's a company that owns a bunch of cars, and you can get online and reserve a car, pick it up a central location when you need it, without the obligations of car ownership. And kind of Emerging Adults' rationale is, hey, a car sits in a garage for 23 hours a day. Why would I bother owning it if I can just take it when I need it? Another kind of debt we are seeing in emerging adults is credit card debt. So generally we see fewer emerging adults getting into credit card debt after the recession. But emerging adults tend to spend the money that they make, but they use credit card debt to kind of make up the balance. And they tend to spend money faster than other age groups and take longer to pay off their credit card debt. What we see is in emerging adults, credit card debt is associated with a feeling of kind of a sense of control or mastery. This is particularly true among low SES individuals who may kind of get this sense of control because it gives them an opportunity to take control of their finances. High SES individuals don't get this kind of boost, emotional boost from holding debt. We also see some interesting gender differences in credit card usage. Women tend to be more likely to use credit cards for appearance and clothing items, whereas men are more likely to spend it on electronics and entertainment and food. Women generally have more kind of positive financial practices, doing things like writing budgets, shopping lists, keeping up with bills and receipts, and planning spending. Whereas men are less likely to keep budgets and financial records. We don't see any difference in the amount of interest that men and women are paying, or any differences in how likely they are to make minimum payments. When we look at students who have multiple credit cards, they're much more likely to feel kind of an emotional high when using them, so there's an emotional component. And they're less likely to borrow money from relatives, so that's kind of a benefit. This is an interesting study that looked at the decision to whether to use cash or credit card. So they asked people to think about a product that they'd been considering purchasing. They had them take a test of reasoning or logic and told them either they did really well or really bad. And so that gave them, the threatening feedback was those who were told they did really bad, and the non-threatening feedback was told to those who were told they did really well. And then the other thing they manipulated was they either asked people to write about something that was important to them, which was the self-affirmation condition, or asked them to write about something that was not important. And the idea is that if you write about something important to you, then you can kind of repair your sense of self-worth after getting this negative feedback. And what they found was that if people get threatening negative feedback, they tend to minimize the psychological pain of spending by using a credit card instead of a cash. However, if they can self-affirm by writing something positive, they don't feel threatened anymore. So it's really those people who get threatening feedback and don't have a chance to repair it, who are doing kind of emotional spending, that are much more likely to pay with credit cards. So when we have kind of wounded egos, we try to compensate by paying with credit card because of the psychological costs of paying with cash. Another component of emerging adult debt is medical bills. So emerging adults are the biggest group of individuals who are uninsured. And medical bills are unexpected expenses that can be very serious. Unpaid medical bills can have huge impacts on credit scores. And actually, relatively recently, credit score companies have revised the rules to wait a little longer until unpaid bills, medical bills, go against you. Education is also an expense. A lot of people focus on college debt, but it's actually the students who aren't going to college who are more likely to get into debt. So without education or a lot of upper level training, people are much more likely to be unemployed. They make minimum payments because they're not making solid earnings. So those who have higher level degrees have lower unemployment and make more money. And just kind of as a personal anecdote, before I finished graduate school, I supported myself. I bought a car and a house. I'd gotten married. But I think what really made me feel like an adult was when I finished grad school and I had to start paying off my student loans. So that was definitely one of the final financial things for me. And what we find is that education debt after 28 is associated with reduced self-esteem and mastery. So those people who really realize that they overestimated how much they'd earn from their degrees are the ones who have the most difficulty with student loan debt. And student loan debt is the only type of debt to increase after the recession. And one way of kind of dealing with this is what's called pay-as-you-earn plans, where the goal is to make education more affordable and prevent students from being overwhelmed in debt by doing things like capping monthly payments, forgiving loans after a certain amount of time. And so these make the loans more manageable. And there are certain factors that kind of predict how likely college students are to be financially at risk, particularly for misusing credit cards. So those who have financial difficulties in general are more likely to carry debt balances, especially if they don't get very much support from their parents. We also see that the rising cost of college means that sometimes the money from loans is not enough to cover the cost of college. So we see students working 20 or more hours a week or using credit cards, and that's kind of the choice that they're forced to make. One of the kind of dangerous, more predatory practices is mail or retail or campus credit cards that really target marketing and can contribute to the increase in credit card debt on campuses. And so there's the potential that kind of financial education programs to target these at-risk groups could help that. This is looking at gender differences in financial habits in general, and what we see is that women tend to make fewer investment risks. So in terms of debt, this is a good thing, but in terms of getting money from savings or high-risk investments, it's actually a disadvantage. And so we do see kind of gender differences in how we manage debt. So we used to kind of make a big deal, and it used to make sense to give senior discounts, and you still see a lot of places that offer senior discounts, but this graph does a nice job showing the share of households in poverty by the age, and what you can actually see is that today young adults, emerging adults, are actually more likely to be economically disadvantaged compared to seniors who are becoming less likely. Seniors are doing better because they're getting increased Social Security and retirement income. So their net worth has actually increased since the 80s, whereas those under 35 have seen their net worth decrease. So we're seeing more and more people living in poverty under 35. Okay, and lastly, you're going to do an activity. Your assignment has to do with financial well-being, but these are just kind of some general good financial practices. So things like having a written budget, which is what you're doing for your assignment, shopping with a list so you only get the items you need, keeping bills and receipts so that you can keep track of where you spend your money, planning your spending, and saving regularly. And so hopefully you'll keep these in mind, and hopefully the assignment that you do for this week will help you make some good financial decisions.